Good morning to you, Chris. Look, we look at what's happened in France in the elections yesterday and, of course, look ahead to our own local elections next week. Any sort of connection between the two, do you think?
Well, I mean, I hope that there'll be one way that the local elections will be similar to the French presidential elections, and that's that the polls will be right, because that's obviously what I'm always judged on. And
French
something
polling
I hope
notoriously accurate, which people don't say about British polling.
This time round, it certainly has been, and we're working as well to try and make polling here as accurate as possible.
But the thing is, you're not so sure these elections are going to be as bad as everyone else is predicting.
I don't think they'll be as bad as everyone else is predicting in terms of
for the government, of course.
For the government, mainly because of where these elections are taking place. They're disproportionately taking place in London. I mean, London's been a disaster for the Conservatives, but it will probably just continue to be a disaster for the Conservatives rather than get any worse. And I think actually people are judging up whether things are getting better or worse for the Tories. And unlike if these, elections were taking place in other parts of the country, it probably won't look so bad for them in London. But actually probably one way that this will be different, I think, from the French presidential election is that obviously Macron was an incumbent. He's won a second term. He's got back into power. Boris Johnson will obviously be hoping to do the same thing in a general election in a few years' time. But he's got a lot of work to do to turn those numbers around between now and the next general election if he wants to have that Macron re-election success, because at the moment things aren't looking particularly good for him in the polls.
I was reading in the Mail this morning that Boris Johnson's personal ratings are beginning to claw back. Is that something that you're seeing?
Yeah, that's probably true. They're certainly not getting any worse, and they're not as bad as they were earlier in the year, around January, say, when Partygate first hit. I think there's a sense that Partygate has done all of the damage it possibly can do. So when we continue talking about it, actually it's not really making Boris Johnson's position any worse.
Has it? Sue Gray's yet to report.
Well, I think everybody's made up their mind on Partygate. Everybody who doesn't like the Prime Minister and the way he's behaved has decided so.
Yeah.
And Boris Johnson's now coming out in response to Partygate and going, yeah, I messed up, but I want to focus on all of the issues that are important. And it's those that are going to decide the results of the next
I think he
general
apologised something like 35 times in the Commons on Tuesday, didn't he, the Prime Minister? But look, I was also reading in the papers this morning that this the famous 1922 committee that has this threshold of 54 letters has got something like 46 now, many of which are post-dated after next week's elections. So I wonder whether or not, these elections will go through sort of relatively, badly, but in an expected way, given, as you say, where they are, and then there could be more trouble then.
Yes, it could be. I mean, or the Sue Gray. Obviously, I'm saying that I don't think Partygate will necessarily have that much more impact among voters, but ultimately it's going to be Conservative MPs that decide Boris Johnson's future. And while the polls aren't getting much worse for Boris Johnson, I actually think that his situation in Parliament is. This week has been, I think you described it as turbulent, but it's been particularly turbulent in Westminster, not necessarily in a way that most voters will notice, but by sort of walking Tory MPs up the hill to vote against a Labour motion, just to walk them back down again to to not bother voting on it at all and sending them all home. I think that showed a lot of Tory MPs that Boris Johnson doesn't necessarily have it together. His new organisation potentially isn't quite working how it should be. And that, I think, has meant that lots of them are more willing to put in letters than they were a few weeks ago.
That being said, his response to the whole Ukraine situation has been world-leading. Many people have been very impressed by Boris Johnson's handling of that, not least President Zelensky himself.
Yes, and also when you ask the British public, they say the same thing. I mean, it's very, very hard at the moment to find an issue that the British public think the Prime Minister's doing a good job on, whether that's crime, immigration, managing the cost of living crisis. The one exception to that is his response to Ukraine, where, actually by quite a bit, people think that Boris Johnson has got the calls right.
Chris, what about the issues that matter most to the electorate there? You mentioned cost of living crisis there. How far up the scale is that?
It's at the top of the scale. And it's at the top of the scale by quite some distance. And look, I still think that the next general election, or the political weather for the next year or so, is basically going to be determined by how the Prime Minister reacts to the cost of living crisis. At the moment, the public do not think he is doing enough in response to rising energy bills, rising costs at the petrol pump. They think he and the Chancellor should be doing a lot more. I think actually the biggest political danger to him is that he doesn't listen to those calls from the British public, doesn't end up doing more, but also doesn't really make the case about why he can't do more. If he doesn't want to do more, he needs to make the case for why he doesn't feel like he can do more. And they're not really doing that at the moment because they keep being distracted by everything else that's going on.
And what about in the local elections? Is that becoming, the centre topic for on the doorstep campaigning as well?
I mean, from what you hear from different political parties, I think it certainly is. And I think Labour is hoping, there's lots of reasons why I'm not convinced Labour's going to do particularly well, but they're hoping they can use these cost of living arguments to make the case that the Conservatives are letting down people in their communities.
OK, Chris, thank you very much indeed. Chris Curtis is a pollster.